Hello and welcome to my channel. So far, we are going to be starting out talking about how to succeed at that stage check or check ride that you have coming up. I'm going to be gearing this mostly toward the Arizona State University program and gearing it toward the instrument stage check, but the tips I give you today are useful for any stage check or check ride that you are going to be an applicant for during your flight training. So, a little bit about me. I graduated from the Arizona State University Professional Pilot degree program, and I am a certified flight instructor in single engine, multi engine, and for instrument flying. So, I'm here to try to offer some assistance to new students coming on, or even students that are in the midst of their training trying to figure out ways to better their chances when it comes up for that test. So let's begin. So, the first thing I like to tell students is when you're in a check ride or stage exam, your instructor has put you there for a reason. So, as instructors, we're always told don't send someone into a test that they're not ready for. So, in our opinion, as instructors, when we send you guys in as students to these tests, you are, in our opinion, very much prepared and ready to take the test. So, it's really important that you understand that and kind of go in with that mode of confidence. So don't be thinking, second guessing yourself. If we're sending you in, we feel that you are ready in our eyes to be ready to take this check ride or stage exam. So, a couple tips on getting ready. So, when you are preparing in the last couple weeks leading up to a check ride or stage exam, you're going to want to make sure that you're constantly being accessible to the examiner and you want to kind of be able to introduce yourself hopefully in a nice way. So when you get assigned a examiner, whether it be for a stage exam, check ride, any kind of practical test, you're going to want to either give them a phone call, or if they tell you to text them at their phone number or send an email, you're going to want to do something to introduce yourself as the applicant or student. And this email or text or phone call should be done in a professional manner, obviously. And you want to make sure that you are reasonably nice to the person, and also it's your chance to kind of ask any questions about them personally. You can maybe try to get to know them a little bit, get to know their background. A lot of the people giving these exams have a pretty diverse background that they're usually willing to share with you. And it helps break the ice a little bit and get you feeling more comfortable with the examiner. Because one of the most stressful situations as a student is going in and being tested orally and flight wise by a person that you've maybe never met before. So, kind of finding ways to break the ice and get yourself comfortable is going to make it a lot easier when it comes to test day. So, tip number kind of two is when you get your scenario. So, usually they're going to tell you to plan some kind of flight to somewhere, some destination. When you get that scenario, you're going to want to make sure that you ask any questions that are open for interpretation about that scenario to them. So if they just say plan across country to leave at this time and go here, you can ask them, all right, like, are we taking a passenger? If they didn't specify, make sure you get all the details that you need to do your proper flight planning and preparations for that scenario. Don't leave anything up for question. And this will show them right off the bat that you're going to take that pilot and command authority that they're looking for in gaining the knowledge to know whether or not you are trying to make sure that you know everything available to you before the flight, which is part of that pre flight action in Regulation 91103. That you want to make sure that you are getting all that available information and treating this as close to a real flight as possible. So, Once you've gathered all the information about the flight scenario that you're given, make sure you get all your questions answered. Feel free to ask your instructor for assistance as well as the examiner. They're usually willing to help you out as long as you ask them the questions before you show up on the day to take the test. Once you're in the room taking the test, that's probably not the best time to ask a question about the flight scenario they gave you. That should be something that you do beforehand. And take advantage of that. A lot of times they're willing to give out a lot more information than you would think, and they want you to succeed 9 times out of 10 or more. Most examiners want you to pass, they don't want to have to fail you. So, you showing them that you're taking that initiative before you even get to the test is really beneficial. So the next part of that is once you get all that information, like I said, you're going to want to establish a really, really good flight plan. You're going to want your nav log to be completed to standard, have all your calculations nicely written out, all your route and altitude and flight considerations that you made when you were planning this flight. It just helps to have all that stuff written down so when they ask you about it during the test, you don't have to try to remember what you were thinking about maybe a day or two ago as you were considering the different options to plan your route, altitude, and stuff like that. If you have it all right in front of you, you have the answers to most of their questions that they're going to ask about this portion of the test right in front of you on your paper when you're in the test. And since you have the paper out in front of you and you're answering, you can just glance down, look at it, and give your answer. It makes it a lot easier and takes away some of the brain thought process that you have to already be having during test day when you're nervous and all the other things combined. So hopefully that'll help you get started. The next piece of advice is after you walk in to start taking the test, you're going to want to introduce yourself and make a really good first impression. This involves wearing a nice shirt, maybe a tie, kind of depending on what check ride you're doing, but don't walk in there in shorts and a t-shirt and act kind of lackadaisical. Like, this is your check ride, and chances are you are paying a decent amount of money for this test, so you might as well make the most of it and make the best first impression that you can. After talking to a lot of different examiners and stage check examiners, DPEs, designated pilot examiners, I've come to the conclusion that they all really look at the person that they're about to examine right when they walk in the door or right when they walk in the airport. Sometimes they'll know you before you know who they are, and they might be watching you. This could be if your exam is coming up next week and you're coming back in from a flight with your instructor prepping for it. They could come up to you and just ask, how are you feeling for the test? And you don't want to give away too much, but you also want to be confident in yourself. That's a big thing. They can really easily sense if you lack confidence, and that's when they'll start to make the test a lot harder for you. So if you're confident in all your answers and what your interactions are with them, it'll help you out in the long run, which is definitely something that's hard to do, especially in your earlier check rides. Taking check rides is almost a skill in itself, and you want to be able to master that skill. So probably with each check ride, you're going to notice things that you can improve on. And it's honestly quite like getting interviewed. They're interviewing you for your next pilot certificate or rating, making sure that you fit the standards and are capable of upholding the requirements and um, limitations set for that next pilot certificate. So if you're getting your first one, which is your private pilot, most of the time, then you're going to be getting your standards for private pilot. And then when you add on an instrument rating, they want to make sure that you are able to uphold the standards to qualify yourself to be a instrument rated pilot. And with that, when you walk in the room, you want to be confident. I usually say give them a good firm handshake. That usually helps, and introduce yourself. A lot of people just kind of sit down in the room and are quiet, don't really say anything. That doesn't really help because then you're just going to make yourself more nervous because they're going to sit there and wait for you to say something. So you want to make sure that you're constantly the one in charge of the check ride. It's your check ride. You're the one who's paying for it. So it's your check ride to either pass or fail. They're just there to monitor and basically supervise. So you want to make sure that you're showing them that you are capable of withholding the information necessary. Once you enter the room, there's going to be a few things they're going to do. They're going to go through your documents, your logbook, your flight plan that you've hopefully prepared, and all the other things that you've brought to make yourself the best possible applicant you could be. I recommend bringing resources, whether that's having all your documents and handbooks from the FAA on your iPad, as well as the FARs and the AIM. But make sure you have access to those as the test is open book. So if you do get asked a question you don't know the answer, the proper response would be is if you think you might know the answer, I would suggest saying, well, I think I know the answer to that, but let me look it up if I can, and I know where to find the answer to confirm it for you. And 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you, okay, go ahead and look it up, and you'll be able to look it up as long as you know where to find it in a reasonable amount of time. They'll usually give you credit for that answer. So that's why it's important to really know your resources and study that material. Because if you know where to find everything, you can usually pass the exam. So now that we're kind of into the exam room, we want all our materials nicely laid out on the table. If there's any kind of exam fee, you don't want to make the mistake of really having them ask you for it. It just kind of is a little bit awkward. As you can imagine, it's not the most easy thing to ask someone for a whole bunch of money as you first meet them. So it's easier to just get that out of the way right away if that's something you have to do, like pay an examiner fee. Usually just have it in a nice envelope for them, and give it to them as they either enter the room or you're getting your stuff out. You can just hand it to them. And it also helps to be there before the examiner. That way, you're not walking in and having to scramble to get all your things out of your bag. And if you happen to leave something in your car, then it doesn't look as bad if they're not even there yet and you just run out to your car real quick, get back before they're there, and they won't even know. As opposed to them having to then wait for you to go back to your car or whatever to go get whatever you forgot. So make sure you show up with everything in hand and be early. I like to preface if your exam is going to start at 9 a.m., you'd probably want to be there and ready no later than 30 to 45 minutes before. Usually an hour before is a good timeline. It gets you prepared. You have some time to kind of relax and get a sense of what the scenario is going to be, and maybe even ask some people around if they've had that examiner what to maybe expect and kind of get a sense of what to expect. So, to kind of close out this video, I'll talk about, I think, the number two big mistakes that people make during the oral portion of any flight test practical. So you're going to have the oral portion and the flight portion. So we're going to focus on the oral portion right now. And the two biggest things I see students make mistakes in is number one, they will give the DPE way too much information. So to counteract this, you also don't want to give too little information. So I like to call it the balancing act game of check rides. So you have to kind of know how much and when to speak and how much to say. You don't want to say too much and you don't want to say too little. But I would say it's probably better to err on the side of saying too little than too much, because if nothing else, if you say too little to an answer to a question, they can always ask you for more. But if you say too much and you end up saying something that turns out to be wrong or inaccurate, they'll most likely further dig into whatever you said. So Never give the DPE too much to dig into. It just makes your check ride last longer, which usually means it's a harder check ride by perception. So never give them things to dig into that they didn't even ask about. Only answer what is asked. So, for example, if someone asks you what the VY speed is in a Cessna 172S model, you would just answer what the speed is. So you'd say, all right, well, the speed is 74 knots for VY. And that would be all you'd have to say. You don't need to then say, well, VX is then your best angle of climb, and that's this speed. You don't need to go into any other speeds, which you'd be surprised, but a lot of people do that just under the nerves of the check ride. You're kind of forced into a habit of spewing out a bunch of information that you've come up with in your brain. So making sure that you only say what is necessary to sufficiently answer the question. You don't want to give them an opportunity to quiz you on something that they probably honestly weren't even planning on asking you anyway, because they're only there to ask you the required questions. And then they're also there to ask you the questions that you bring up during the test, which a lot of people do end up getting themselves into a what I call a hole, where you bring up something and then they realize, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. That wasn't really the angle I was going down. But now, since you brought it up, tell me about this. So, an example of that is if they ask you about VX or VY and you say the other one and you start explaining how they're different, they could be like, all right, well, now tell me about best glide speed. Since we brought up other V speeds, I guess I'll just run through them all. That's what's going to kind of go through in their mind because you brought it up. So it almost looks like you want to get tested on that. So just answer the question that they're asking to a sufficient manner. With that, if they say, what's VY? And you just say 74, that's probably not sufficient either, because you'd want to tie a unit into it, because then they could be like, well, 74 what? Like 74 inches, 74 miles, 74 meters. Like, you don't know what the 74 is, so make sure you say 74 knots. Don't make them play like a cat and fish or cat and mouse game where they're constantly asking you for more information. That's not really the way you want it to go, because it comes off as you being incooperative, basically, with them and their questioning. If you're constantly only answering 1 to 2 word answers, like, well, what's situational awareness? Being aware. That's not really a sufficient answer. They're going to want the actual answer of knowing your surroundings and everything that's going on and what is coming next. So, being able to decipher what they want out of each question is probably one of the most challenging things that people struggle with when it comes to the oral portion, because it is something and a skill that is not really relevant anywhere else. And it is something very specific to the FAA oral test, because once you bring something up, even if that thing is not part of the testing requirements, they are now mostly obligated to ask you about it, for one, and two, they can, because now you've brought it up. So you've brought it into the testing realm of standards. So you don't want to add anything to the list of things that you're going to get tested on. It's already a lot of knowledge that you have to know for the test. So why add to more that you can get tested on when there's already a lot that you do have to know? So, and that seems to be the reason why people get kind of complacent maybe with their answers, and they just kind of go off on a tangent for a second. And that's when you usually get yourself into trouble. Sometimes you're able to get yourself out of it if you do know very well about what you're talking about. But even then, it's not a show off moment. You're not in a check ride to show off. You're there to pass and do well and progress. So don't try to be a show off know it all and bring up these random things that they're not asking about, because most of the time it will shoot yourself in the foot and make it so you end up not passing the test, which it would be kind of sad to pass the test or not pass the test, sorry, and not even be unsatisfactory on an item that was part of the requirements that they were going to ask you. If you're going to be unsatisfactory on a test, at least have it be something that they were going to have be a part of the test. Don't have it be something that you brought into the test on your own. The tip number two that I think people struggle with a lot during oral tests is going to be answering a question too quickly. And I notice this when I do mock oral exams for students. I ask a question, and a lot of times as a student, you might have heard the exact same question. So you might not even wait until the entire question is asked, which is a really bad habit, but it's something humans do. We're very impatient. So I've asked people questions, and I've gotten about halfway through the question, and before I even finish, they're giving me an answer. And a lot of times when people do that, I will purposely change the question, and so will the examiner. They're going to change it, and then once you gave that answer, that's your answer to the question. So they're probably going to change what you are used to just because you're answering before they've even finished. And this kind of goes into that checkride etiquette. Let the examiner ask the question, and then give it a second. So the tip I usually give is bring a few cups or bottles of water or some kind of drink into the test. And every question they ask you, just force yourself to have a drink of water. There's a couple benefits to that. One, it'll make it so you're probably not going to talk while you have water in your mouth because you're not going to want to spit or drool on the table or the examiner as you're answering a question. So you're not going to talk when you have a mouthful of water. So it'll force your brain to actually slow down and think to make sure that you're going to give the right answer. Because when people rush, usually they're going to give the wrong answer or say something a little bit inaccurate. And then what happens is if you're going off on a tangent real quick and you're speaking really fast, the examiner is not going to necessarily be able to keep up. So what they're going to do is they're going to say, "Oh, hold on a second. What did you say?" And a lot of times when people are in a testing situation, they're already kind of nervous and tense. And if they're stopped in the middle of explaining an answer, they're going to immediately think they said something wrong. And even if they didn't, they're now probably going to change their answer to something else or just kind of get brain frozen, stuck, not be able to answer the question. Where had they just taken a second to relax and just take the question in and let their brain indulge it for a second, they would then be able to answer the question accurately. So when you're asked a question, always just take that sip of water. And the other good thing about that is if you're drinking a lot of water, you're probably going to need a break at some point. So it kind of keeps you hydrated, your brain functioning. Another option is to bring snacks. So you could have like a snack every time the question's asked. Don't make it annoying. Obviously, kind of be subtle about it. Usually, you just kind of take a nice sip of water as they're asking the question, and then it kind of lets you think about what they're asking. And if you need them to rephrase any part of the question, that is totally within your right as an applicant. You can ask them to rephrase any question they ask if you don't understand what they're asking. Um, the worst they could say is, "No, I cannot rephrase it for you because I will end up giving you the answer if I do." But in most cases, they're happy to ask the question another way to hopefully make it so you can understand what they're asking. Because a lot of times they're not out there to trick you, they're just trying to verify that you know the knowledge that you're supposed to know at that point in your training. So, with those two tips, taking your time and making sure that you only answer what is asked. Those are going to be my two big test taking tips for the oral exam on both check rides, stage exams, any kind of oral test that the FAA is giving you. I hope you stay tuned, and if you like this video, stay tuned for more, and I'll be giving more tips as we go. Thank you for joining.